All right, as we continue our study of solving quadratic equations, now we're going to be looking at solving quadratic equations by factoring. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to solve a quadratic equation by factoring. All right, to solve a quadratic equation by factoring, you should do the following. First of all, we need to make sure the equation is set equal to 0, just like we do when we are solving by graphing. The next thing we want to do, if we want to solve by factoring, we need to factor, and hopefully the expression will be factorable. After that, we're going to set each part equal to 0 and solve for x. And when we do that, we are actually using the zero product property. Right? And then after that, your answer will be where the parabola or the quadratic hits the x-axis. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into an example. This first one says to solve each equation below by factoring. So first of all, you'll notice it is a quadratic because of the squared, and then it does already equal 0, so we are set. So the next thing what we would like to do is factor it. Since it's a quadratic trinomial, we are going to go ahead and take the 1 times the negative 30, so we're going to write negative 30 off to the side, and then be thinking what times what would give us negative 30. Negative 10 times 3, negative 3 times 10, negative 6 times 5, negative 5 times 6. Now which one of those choices would add together to give me negative 1? It's going to be the negative 6 and 5 because negative 6 plus 5 is negative 1. So now I'm going to get ready to factor by grouping. So I'm going to have x squared minus 6x plus 5x minus 30. And I'm going to go ahead and group. So we're going to factor out an x in this first part. When I do that, I'll have x minus 6 left. And then plus in the second part, I'm going to factor out a 5. And if I factor that out, I'll have x minus 6. And really I was just dividing each part by those numbers if you needed that extra step. Now I notice they both have an x minus 6. And then also what's left, I'd have x plus 5. All right, this equation still equals 0. So now from here, I said once we factor it, we're going to use the zero product property and set each part equal to 0. So I'm going to draw a line down here. I'm going to take x minus 6 and set it equal to 0. And then I'm going to take the x plus 5 and set it equal to 0. And when we do that, to get the x by itself, I'll simply add 6 to both sides. So notice I'll get x equals 6, and here I'll subtract 5 from both sides, and I'll get x equals negative 5. So my graph is going to hit the x-axis at negative 5, and it's also going to hit it at 6. If I were to graph that, that is what I would see. All right, on number 2, this one is still a quadratic equation, so I know I'm going to be trying to solve it by factoring. This does not equal 0 though, so the first thing that I need to do is have it equal 0, so I'm going to get rid of the 8 by subtracting 8 from both sides, and then the left side, I need to write it in standard form, so I'm going to have 3x squared minus 2x minus 8 equals 0. Okay, from here we're going to go ahead and factor just like we did number 1. We'll take 3 times negative 8, and that's going to give us negative 24. And then we just need to think of some choices. Negative 8 times 3, negative 3 times 8, negative 2 times 12, negative 6 times 4, negative 4 times 6. So we've got all sorts of choices. I would like to get negative 2, so I'm going to pick this one right here because negative 6 plus 4 is negative 2. So let me get it set up for grouping. So I have 3x squared minus 6x plus 4x minus 8. Now I'm ready to group. My GCF of my first part is going to be 3x. And when I divide that out, I'll get x minus 2. And then plus the GCF of my second part is 4. So if I divide that out, I'm going to have x minus 2. Please notice we have x minus 2 for both of them. Then what I have left is 3x plus 4. Okay, this actually still equals 0, so now we're going to use the zero product property. We'll set each part equal to 0, so x minus 2 equals 0, and 3x plus 4 equals 0. Okay, and then on this one, if I add 2 to both sides, I'll get x equals 2. And here I'm going to have to do a two-step problem. Well, first of all, subtract 4. So I'll get 3x equals negative 4, and then to get the x by itself, I will have to divide by 3, so x equals negative 4/3. So this one touches the x-axis at 2 and at negative 4/3, and it doesn't really matter the order that I write it in. Okay, one thing I just wanted you to notice on these problems, just a little simpler way to save us a couple steps here. You'll notice, especially when we were looking at this before we started the lesson, if I had x minus 6, notice my answer was x equals 6. And when I had x plus 5, my answer was x equals negative 5. And when I had x minus 2, my answer was x equals positive 2. So similar to when we find the vertex of something in parentheses, that same thing applies where we end up getting the opposite. That did not work so well with this part right here, so that's why I'm showing you the long way to do it. Okay, problem 3, x squared equals 2x. Notice it is a quadratic, but it does not equal 0, so we're going to have to subtract 2x to get it to equal 0. So I'm going to have x squared minus 2x equals 0. Okay, this one is not a quadratic trinomial, so I'm not going to do the trick that I was doing in 1 and 2. This one I'm just going to simply do the GCF. So the GCF of this one would be just x, and if I divide both parts by x, I'm going to get x minus 2. I still have it equal 0. Then I'm going to apply the zero product property. So I'm going to draw my line, set each part equal to 0. Okay, notice the first one is already solved, great. This next one, I'll add 2 to both sides. I get x equals 2. So this graph will equal 0 when x equals 0 and x equals 2. So those would be my answers for that one. Okay, my next one, notice that this one doesn't equal 0 again, but it is a quadratic, so to make it equal 0, I'll subtract 7x from both sides. Okay, this one's a little tricky because on the left side, we need to make sure we write it in standard form. So I'm going to have x squared minus 7x minus 30 equals 0. Okay, now from here, we can go ahead and factor. Since it's a trinomial, we can take our 1 times our negative 30, put that off to the side. Let's think, negative 3 times 10, negative 10 times 3. I could keep going, but I already found it because negative 10 plus 3 is negative 7. So we're going to have x squared minus 10x plus 3x minus 30. I'm going to go ahead and group. My GCF of the first part will be x. And if I factor the x out, I'll have x minus 10. And then plus, my GCF of my second part is going to be 3. So if I divide that out, I'll get x minus 10. Notice they both have an x minus 10. And what I have left is x plus 3. And once again, now we'll set that equal to 0. Okay, if you notice the pattern, you could go ahead and save your shortcut right here, but I'm just going to go ahead and set each part equal to 0 for those who are still not quite seeing the pattern. From here, I'm going to add 10 to both sides. So I'll get x equals 10. And from here, we'll subtract 3, and I'll get x equals negative 3. So my graph hits the x-axis at negative 3 and 10. We're just going to try to ignore that bell there. Okay, number 5. This one is quadratic. It does say equals 0 already. If you would like to go ahead and try this one, go ahead and pause the video and see how you did on it. This one I'm going to go ahead and do a GCF. My GCF is going to be 2x. If I divide the 2x out, I'm going to get x minus 4. I'll set it equal to 0. My zero product property, draw my line, set each part equal to 0. On this first part, to get x by itself, we'll divide by 2. 0 divided by 2 is 0. Here, if I add 4 to both sides, I'll get x equals 4. Great. Number 6, we have x squared minus 100 equals 0. This one, it is equal to 0, so that's great. We can't do our method where we put a number over to the side because we're missing that middle term, but this is a shortcut one because I can square root 100. So if I shortcut factor this one, it will be x plus 10, x minus 10, and I'll still have it equal 0. If I use the zero product property, once again, unless you notice the fast way to do it, that's totally fine. I'm going to set each part equal to 0. And now to solve, I'll subtract 10. So I'll get x equals negative 10. I'll add 10. I'll get x equals positive 10. So you'll notice on this one, again, plus 10, the opposite of it was negative 10, minus 10, the opposite was 10. So this quadratic would touch the x-axis at negative 10 and at 10. Okay, so hopefully now you are comfortable and familiar with solving a quadratic equation by factoring.